Hello everybody and welcome to my series review of The Witches of Eileanan by Kate Forsyth. It is quite reasonable to say that this is my favourite fantasy series ever, all time. Maybe except Harry Potter, but medieval fantasy kind of series. I have here with me the sixth book, The Fathomless Caves, but the first one is called Dragonclaw. I like it because it's a little bit like Game of Thrones, but the plot is less complicated, there are less characters to remember, and it's a lot less confronting, even though it still has all the perfect balance of like battles and blood and love and sex, etc. All the things that you want in a good fantasy series. Essentially, these books follow the lives of a lot of different characters, the main character being a young girl called Isabeau. Isabeau in the first book lives in this kind of secluded valley with her mentor called Megan. And Megan is a sorceress, and this is a dangerous time to be a sorceress because once upon a time witches were free to roam and they were embraced and they were an important part of daily life in Eileanan, which is the sort of realm where they live. But they are now hunted and persecuted and, executed, etc. because of this new queen who has come and implemented this change. So Megan and Isabeau live in this secluded valley where they sort of, live off the nature. Isabeau's really feisty and naive, and she doesn't understand what power she has. And then one day it comes a time, I'm not going to give away any details, where she has to leave this valley and go on a journey, a very dangerous journey, to sort of do to achieve an end of a quest. I don't want to give away any of the plot, but this happens and she finds out that she has a twin sister called Iseult, who has kind of been raised on the spine of the world, which is essentially a really snowy mountain range where the Cancoban live, and the Cancoban are kind of snow fairies, and they're very harsh people, they're very stoic and unemotional, they don't show their emotions, and so finally at some point Isabeau meets her sister, all these things happen, and it's just a really, really long twisted path that all concludes really nicely. I like that although this series has a good balance of sadness and loss and happiness, etc., it has a really good ending. I hate going through all the trouble of reading a series and hating the ending. This has a really satisfying end, so that's one of the main things that made me fall in love with it. Also, that Kate Forsyth develops her characters really well. And so while at the start Isabeau was naive and childish, she was 16, she was young, she'd never experienced the world. By the end of the series, she'd matured and grown into this gorgeous, fully fledged character, and I loved her at the end. She had, suffered a lot, she'd gone through a lot, but she came out of it and she was strong and she was wonderful. And the same goes for pretty much all of the other characters. We meet like an exiled prince who was turned into a raven, who had to be turned back into a human. We meet a band of jongleurs who sing and have magic in their voices. We meet all of these different characters that just create this beautiful and intricate plot that isn't too hard to understand. I think in Game of Thrones it's difficult to follow because a lot of characters have really similar names and you're like, well, where do they come in? But you don't belong here. With this series, the only two names that are similar is there is a young prince called Duncan and a young sort of older man called Duncan, and that's like the only two similar names, and you're like, wait a minute. But it sort of sorts itself out. I also like this series because it has a realistic integration of fairies. I'm not a huge fan when people sort of put in fairies in not a very good way. I think it has to be done very specifically and very well, and Kate Forsyth has definitely managed it. She has a vast array of sort of magical creatures, and they all make sense in this context, which I like because I don't like feeling that sort of some of them are sticking out where they don't belong, or like in some fantasy books people just chuck in elves or fairies just because it's a fantasy book, and I think it needs to have one in there. I love these books because they all feel like they're a part of this and they're meant to be in there. So none of the fairies feel out of place or, just chucked in at the last minute for the sake of it. There's also a religion in here. I think it's sort of close to paganism, and it's just a really beautiful representation of unity with Earth and all the elements around you, which I really liked. I really enjoyed. It's not for everyone, but it's not like a huge part of the novel. For the witches it is. The witches are sort of a select group of people with magical powers, obviously, but for them it's a big deal, but for the rest of us as a reading group, and also, you know, for some of the characters it's not a big deal at all. Except that this whole series is essentially about witches trying to find freedom. It doesn't really centre itself around that. The storyline is much more complex. It also has a sort of another symbolic religion which is never named, but I'm assuming it's kind of Christianity because it's sort of described as a fearsome god who condemns sin, etc, etc. And yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting play on that. This book is quite confronting at first in reading it, because Kate Forsyth does this thing where she writes all of the dialogue in kind of like a Scottish accent. So instead of "I know you,"